Welcome to presentation 2 of this 3-part overview of Control to Catastrophe, CASEAR. In this presentation, we'll be looking at the core rules of play, how units move, how they shoot, and how melee is resolved. We'll also, of course, deal with how units break, and also how armies either achieve victory or suffer defeat. One of the things I want to stress is that this overview will leave a lot of details to the side. We're really mostly looking at how the core rules play out in their basic form. I would suggest that, first and foremost, you purchase the rules if you want to see more details about this game. And if you have already purchased the rules, it would be a good idea to have perhaps the play sheet to hand as we look at sort of examples of play, and you can see things like modifiers that are made reference to. Like most war games, Control to Catastrophe has a sequence of play. It's quite lockstep, and it is of the I go, you go style. I should point out that there is in the optional rules an alternative sequence of play which randomizes the order across both sides that actions are taken. But for large games, games with multiple players, or games presented at a convention, it's probably best to stick to the I go, you go construct. The sequence of play for the active side starts with a rally phase where unformed markers are removed. Unformed markers are attached to units that, for example, cross difficult terrain, again unforming the unit. It can also occur because of certain maneuvers that the units perform, causing once again the unit to become unformed. These unformed markers awarded in the active side's previous active turn are now removed unless the unit is in melee. The next part of the turn sequence is the movement phase. In this I go, you go system, only the active side is the one that performs movement, starting with units under momentum and then going on to other units. I should point out that the non-active side has to be fairly observant as to the maneuvers of their opponent, mostly because, in fact, some of their units might have to respond to the movements of the active side. The next phase is the shooting phase, and perhaps a little unusually, it is only the active side that performs shooting. The non-active side has to, of course, watch to take hits from the shooting, determine whether units become shaken, or whether they've reached a threshold of catastrophe. Finally, it's the melee phase, and this phase both sides participate in, exchanging blows, rolling dice, of course rolling for hits, and there's a whole list of things that might occur as a consequence of melee. Once that active side turn is completed, the sides, of course, switch roles, and now the non-active player becomes, or the non-active side, becomes the active side. Because of the use of a gridded playing surface, movement is fairly easy. All units have a movement allowance of 1 to 3 movement actions. The movement actions can be used to perform any of the following, and it should be pointed out that, generally speaking, these actions can be performed in any order. A unit can perform a forward move, and this is a move into adjacent boxes up to the movement allowance, again straightforward. A heavy infantry unit with 1 movement action would, of course, move just straight into that next box. A light cavalry unit, of course, has 3 movement actions and therefore can move straight forward 3 boxes. A diagonal move is a move that slides the unit, retaining its current facing, 45 degrees either to the left or to the right into the adjacent box. It should be pointed out here that a diagonal move is one that can only be done once, regardless of the number of movement actions a unit is awarded. so that light cavalry unit with 3 movement actions would still only be allowed to do 1 diagonal move. It can do that diagonal move either first, second, or third after performing, let's say, forward moves, but it can only do 1. The next kind of movement is the turning move, and this has the unit turn 90 degrees right or left while remaining in the box. This uses up 1 movement action. So for example, heavy infantry would only actually be able to do a turning move left or right. But once again, a light cavalry unit could turn, perform a diagonal move, and then move forward, again limited only by the fact that diagonal moves and now turning moves can only be performed once. Light units can perform a backward move, and this is often done while retaining their current facing. This is only ever 1 box, with an exception for horse archers, which can perform a 2-box backward move, but that's an exception. Generally speaking, it's just 1 box. Finally, all units can perform an about face move. Again, remaining in their box, they turn 180 degrees. What's important here is that the unit geometry, the position, let's say, of different troop types, if they happen to be a mixed unit of, let's say, spear and bow, they are always in the same arrangement. So if the bowmen are at the rear of the unit, they remain at the rear of the unit even when the unit does an about face move. Beyond that, however, if the unit has additional movement actions after performing the about face, they're permitted to use them. Before we go into greater detail about moving units, I want to address this concept of units becoming unformed. An essential notion of this game is that forward moves are easy, and that anything else makes the unit unformed. So a unit performing a turning move, a diagonal move, these can cause disruption in the ranks and renders the unit unformed. However, if the unit surrenders a movement action, the unit remains formed. Now you can immediately understand that for a heavy infantry unit that only has 1 movement action, anything other than performing a forward move will render that unit unformed. So if it does a diagonal move, it becomes unformed. But for units that have 2 or more movement actions, they can perform those complex maneuvers, the turning moves, the diagonal moves. And if they surrender 1 of those additional movement actions, they will remain formed. Note that terrain can also cause a unit to become unformed. And again, I think it's reasonably intuitive that, for example, close order units will have difficulty perhaps crossing difficult ground of one type or another. You can look at the terrain rules to see the details about which kinds of units become unformed when crossing certain kinds of terrain. So unformed is an important concept in the game since it affects the unit's performance in combat. So have a look at the rules to inform yourself about unformed. Related to the notion that forward movement is easy is this concept of momentum. Earlier on I mentioned in the turn sequence that the first thing you do as the active side in the movement phase is move units under momentum. Momentum is this idea that units that have initiated an advance against the enemy are actually quite difficult to control. They're more difficult to stop, they're more difficult to maneuver in complex ways. They want to keep advancing upon the enemy. And the momentum rules address that as a problem, as a tactical problem. Circumstantially, there's ways of controlling units, and of course you can also do what's referred to as a control test, something we'll be dealing with later. But the momentum rules, I think, add a really interesting wrinkle to the game. So I would encourage you to learn those rules and apply them, again, at the start of the movement phase of the active side. We're going to briefly look at an example of movement, in this case, of a heavy mounted unit. I'm not going to, of course, address all the movement options for every unit type, but I think this heavy mounted unit will offer enough examples of those movement options to satisfy the curiosity of those wondering how movement is undertaken in the rules. So here we have a rather old unit from my collection of Byzantine heavy cavalry. This is a mixed heavy unit of bow and lances. Now this heavy mounted unit has a movement allowance of 2 actions. And so in the middle image, you can see that if it's going to perform a forward move, it could move 1 box directly forward or 2 boxes. And in the right-hand picture, you can see that with the star being its starting position, it's opted to move 2 boxes straight forward. Here we have that same heavy cavalry unit now performing a diagonal move. Now, with a diagonal move, you're only permitted to do 1, even though the heavy cavalry unit can perform 2 actions. Only one of them can be a diagonal move. In the picture on the left, the mounted unit has decided to make 1 diagonal unit obliquely to the left, 45 degrees into that adjacent box, and then is completing its move by moving 1 box forward. Now you'll notice the little tuft of grass that's behind the unit. That's a marker to denote the fact that this unit has become unformed, because when a unit performs a diagonal move, it does become unformed unless it surrenders one of its movement actions. In the second picture, you can see that the heavy cavalry unit has simply done the diagonal move, nominally becoming unformed, but because it doesn't complete its move, in other words, it doesn't use its second movement action, it does not become unformed. Now here we have that same heavy cavalry unit performing a turning move. In the first picture you can see that it has turned to the left. It could choose to turn to the right, and it stays in its box, expending 1 movement action in order to make that turn. Now, like with diagonal moves, you can combine turning moves with other kinds of movement, including a diagonal move, or in this case, perhaps a forward move. But a turning move, like a diagonal move, will render the unit unformed unless it surrenders a movement action. In the first picture, the unit has made the turn but has remained in place. In the second picture, the unit has turned and advanced into the next box using a forward move, and because it has done 2 actions including a turning move, it becomes unformed. An about-face move is basically the same as a turning move with just a couple of additional restrictions. You can look those up yourself. I do want to point out that this image of the phalanx I think speaks to the complexities of movement, remembering that units in this game represent certainly hundreds if not thousands of actual warriors. Any kind of complex maneuver must have been extraordinarily difficult for these armies. Generally speaking, wargaming rules are very generous with movement, and grid games can look particularly generous given the kind of awkward 90-degree turns that units make. I hope that some of the restrictions and penalties associated with movement, for example the notion of becoming unformed, mitigates some of that generosity embedded in any wargame, and particularly the grid game. I noted earlier that light units are permitted to perform a backward move, and I wanted to simply embed that into a part of the movement rules related specifically to light units known as evading. Because of the turn sequence and the fact that the active side is the only one that actually performs, shall we say, voluntary movement, it was necessary to create an option for light units to give ground. And this, as I say, is called evading. And this is done by the non-active side. Here's an example of two units facing each other. The one on the left is a javelin-armed open order unit. It's a light unit, and it's facing a massed order heavy foot unit. I want to stress that this heavy foot unit would never be able to specifically charge these open order javelineers. What they do is they either push them back, in other words, the open order unit gives ground and evades from them, or if they have nominally contacted them, they would disperse them. In this particular example, it's the heavy unit's active turn, and it wants to advance into the box occupied by the open order unit. In the first picture, we can see the intention of the heavy infantry unit, that it wants to move into the box occupied by the open order unit. Prior to moving any units, we have to first see what reaction the open order unit might take to this advance of the enemy. This is done, of course, by the non-active player, the player that is responding to the active player's move of the heavy infantry. In order for the open order unit to successfully evade, to withdraw away from the heavy infantry, it has to pass a control test. Now I'm going to be dealing with all the different tests in the game, control tests, catastrophe tests, and rupture catastrophe tests at the end of the presentation, but I will address it now to offer an example of how this works. In order to pass any of these tests, you have to roll a single d6 and get a result that is below the combat and control value of the unit in question. This open order javelin unit has a combat and control value of 3. This is very typical for open order units, brittle units. Now, on first blush, you would say, well, that die roll of 3 is a failure. But there are modifiers, not many, but a few critical modifiers that will make it easier for this open order unit to successfully evade from that heavy unit. One modifier is the fact that this unit is not shaken. It's suffered no hits and therefore has not become shaken. Its shaken trigger is 3. But it has 0 hits. So it gets a +1 to its combat and control value, a 4. Effectively, it's already passed. There is another modifier that gives this open order unit an advantage when evading from a slower opponent. It's the difference in their movement allowances, which is 1. Open order units move 2 boxes or have a movement allowance of 2. The heavy foot unit has a movement allowance of 1. So here again, that difference is applied as a modifier to the combat and control value, making that value ultimately net out at 5. So this open order unit has very successfully passed its control test and is now permitted to give ground. It can evade. In the third picture, you can see that it has evaded 1 box directly to the rear. It's done a backward move, and the heavy infantry presses forward, completing its move, occupying the box that previously had been occupied by the open order unit. Now, of course, next turn, that open order unit will be able to throw its javelins, perform shooting, and subsequently, when the enemy want to move again, it can perform yet another evade. This is actually a typical way that open order units skirmish against heavy units. By the way, all open order and loose order units can perform evade moves, whether they're foot or mounted units. I want to turn our attention to shooting, but before going there, I just want to make a brief comment about all kinds of combat, shooting and melee. The mechanics to resolve combat are really quite simple. Regardless of whether you're shooting or resolving a melee, you are going to roll a handful of six-sided dice. And for each of those dice that score a 4, 5, or 6, you will achieve a hit. That never changes. You're always looking for 4, 5, or 6. What does change is the number of dice thrown. This can vary, of course, depending on unit, because the base number of dice that you throw is founded on the combat and control value of the unit. So those skirmishers, those open order javelineers from the previous slide, their base combat and control value, their base number of combat dice is 3. Modifiers then add or subtract dice. So the 4, 5, or 6 result never changes. This is a crucially important, I think a very basic thing, but a crucially important thing in the game. And I think it should be easily memorized. Okay, so let's deal with the mechanics of shooting. As noted earlier, only the active side is permitted to shoot, and it does so with units equipped with missile weapons. These units are noted in all the army lists. Now, of course, a shooting unit has to have a target, and that target must be visible within the arc of fire, which is usually 45 degrees off of center to the left or right. And of course, the unit must be in range, and the ranges are noted both in the rulebook and on the play sheet. So let's have a look at an example of shooting. Here we are back again with those javelineers, that open order unit, confronted by that massed foot unit that drove it back through an evasion. In this particular case, we're going to say that the massed unit already has 4 hits. And as a massed medium-sized unit, it has hit triggers of 6, 12, 3. 6 is its shaken trigger, 12 is its catastrophe trigger, and 3 is the rupture catastrophe trigger, but that's only applied in melee. Looking at the second picture, we can see that the javelineers have 3 shooting dice. This is, of course, equal to its combat and control value of 3. In this particular case, no modifiers apply to affect the number of dice thrown. It's possible, for example, if it was targeting a well-armored unit, it would take a -1 penalty in number of dice thrown. But in this case, none of that applies, and it rolls its full complement of 3 six-sided dice. As you can see, they've scored 2 hits. 4, 5, and 6s are hits. They've scored 2 hits. And those 2 hits are immediately added to the total number of hits carried by the unit, which now is 6. The massed foot unit has now reached its shaken hit trigger and immediately becomes shaken. It's true of the game that effects of combat are immediately applied, and in fact, all things are done immediately and completely for each type of action, in so much that this unit shoots, the effects are applied, any further effects would be, of course, also applied. Let's say if a unit broke and it would be removed, and this is all done prior to moving to the next unit. We want to now turn our attention to melee, but of course first we have to get into melee, and that requires us to have a conversation about charging. To engage the enemy in close combat in melee, a unit must first charge into contact. There are 2 types of charges. There's the forward charge and the diagonal charge, and we're going to look at each in turn. The forward charge is the most common and effective type of charge move. A forward charge might be preceded by other types of movement, to bring the enemy units, the target of the charge, into a position adjacent to the front of the charging unit in the next box. Once in that position, the forward charge has the charging unit simply make contact with the grid line of the box it occupies. In other words, a forward charge actually leaves the charging unit in the box they're already in. A forward charge absorbs a movement action. The enemy unit, of course, meets the chargers at the grid line. Something that's really important about this, and this is a peculiarity of grid-based games, is that the terrain occupied by the target of the charge determines the terrain over which the melee is fought. So if a unit occupying open ground is charging a unit inside of woods, even though the chargers remain in their box in the open, the melee is considered to be fought in the woods. Here we have an example of a forward charge conducted by a cavalry unit against a heavy foot unit. The heavy cavalry unit has a 2-box movement allowance. It uses one of its move actions to enter the box directly to its front, and then uses another action to perform the forward charge. When performing the forward charge, it moves just simply up to the grid line of the box it already occupies, and the heavy infantry are slid forward to denote the fact that a melee has occurred. The diagonal charge addresses a limitation of a gridded playing surface, in that it allows a unit in one sweeping move to contact an enemy unit positioned diagonally adjacent to it. This action absorbs the entire movement allowance of a unit, and for heavy infantry, usually only allowed one move action, this represents a very dramatic and generous action. What it really represents is a clumsy wheeling into contact against a misaligned enemy, or an opportunistic charge into the flank of a pinned enemy, but one where order has broken down and a rather, as I say, clumsy movement into contact is made. Let's look at examples to illustrate some of the advantages and problems associated with the diagonal charge. Now here we have an example of a diagonal charge that addresses that problem associated with grid games and the fact that these two units in a conventional war game would simply wheel and close into combat. In a gridded game, this requires some kind of fix, and the diagonal charge in this game is that fix. If the unit on the bottom left, the unit with the red shields, was the active sides unit, and if it had to perform normal moves in order to engage its opponent, it would of course require 3 turns worth of movement. It would move forward in this turn, in its next active turn it would make a turning move, and finally in the third active turn it could finally make that forward charge. Of course the enemy would be long gone by then probably, but this would be the normal movement rules that would be required in order to make contact with the enemy. The diagonal charge resolves this. In one sweeping move, the unit moves forward, turns, and performs a forward charge into the enemy. And the enemy, the non-active enemy, is permitted to respond to that by turning to face, and both units become unformed, representing that kind of clumsy contact that would probably apply even in a non-gridded game where they were forced to wheel and move into contact. So the diagonal charge is a solution to the gridded playing surface and facilitates aggressive action in play. Now, here we have a combination of a forward charge and a diagonal charge, and this can be a very nasty combination of actions. Here, the side on the left is the active side, so the unit with red shields and the cavalry unit at the bottom of the frame. The first action taken by the active side in the movement phase is to perform a forward charge with that heavy infantry unit. Now, having pinned that enemy heavy infantry unit, the cavalry can now perform a diagonal charge into their flank. The enemy cannot respond, already being engaged frontally, and being struck in the flank, as we will discover in a moment, they automatically become unformed. Now, the cavalry themselves are also unformed and will be slightly less effective as a consequence of that. But the flank charge is magic in terms of the disaster that it can inflict upon the enemy, and that unit it's engaging frontally will probably cause it no end of grief. So the diagonal charge, which in other games might be an overlapping attack or a wheel and a charge, whatever it might be, this is now the perfect context in which to perform a diagonal charge. The charge by the active side brings a unit into melee. I should point out, for things like shock, it doesn't matter who actually moved into melee contact. Both sides would get shock bonus dice. For example, 2 units of knights crashing into each other. Well, in fact, it's only the active side that's moving, but both sides derive the benefit of shock. Each turn of melee, both sides roll dice to inflict hits, as per the procedures I've noted before regarding combat. I'll be looking at some examples of melee that will review that process. The side that produces the most hits is the winner. The other side is, of course, the loser. And if both sides score the same number of hits in a particular turn of melee, it's deemed a tie. When a unit is worn down to its catastrophe trigger, and it lost or tied that turn of melee, it must take a catastrophe test and might break. So in this respect, melees can be a bit of a grind, with one side or the other arriving or exceeding its catastrophe trigger and being forced to take a test that might break the unit. Now, I should note that a unit that loses a turn of melee particularly badly, with a difference of hits equaling its rupture trigger, that unit might be forced to take a rupture catastrophe test before reaching its catastrophe trigger. So melee is something that is initiated by the active side, but is engaged in turn to turn by both sides. Once a unit's in melee, generally speaking, it cannot move, it cannot disengage, and it must see that fight out to the end. The one exception to that is when cavalry engage infantry, and we'll touch upon that later on. So let's look at an example of melee. In this particular case, it's fought between a unit of Greek mercenaries versus a unit of Galatians. The Greek mercenaries have a combat and control value of 4, as do the Galatians, but the Galatians have the benefit, at least for the first turn of melee contact, of shock, and will derive a +1 benefit for that single turn. As you might already know, both units have hit triggers of 6, 12, 3. So at 6 hits, they'll become shaken. 12 hits, they'll be at their catastrophe trigger. And 3 hits is the rupture trigger if there is a significant difference in hits between the units in a single turn of combat. For the sake of this example, let's assume that the Greeks had suffered 3 hits prior to this melee starting, perhaps from shooting. And as I noted, the Galatians, of course, get that extra d6 for shock. So if we look at the number of dice thrown, we'll note that the Greeks, they throw 4 dice, equivalent to their combat and control value, and have no other modifiers. The Galatians, they too have a combat and control value of 4, but on that first turn of melee, get 1 extra die. In this particular example, each side inflicted 3 hits, remembering that 4, 5, and 6 equal hits. This is a tie, but the Greeks, having already suffered 3 hits previously, have now arrived at 6 hits and immediately become shaken, since 6 hits equals their shaken trigger, and a marker is placed next to the unit to denote that fact. In subsequent turns, they will lose 1 of their combat dice as a modifier for being shaken. Here we have the same units, but a very different scenario. In this scenario, the Galatians are entering the melee with 1 hit already from previous combat. The Greeks have no hits. It's the first turn of contact, and so the Galatians get their shock bonus. Both units have a combat and control value of 4, and so the net number of dice thrown by each side is 4 dice for the Greeks, 5 dice for the Galatians. This time, however, in contrast to the previous scenario, the results are very different. The Greeks inflicted just 1 hit, and this is applied immediately, increasing the number of hits on the Galatians to 2. The Galatians, however, struck hard and inflicted 4 hits against the Greeks, again marked immediately. Now what's important here is that the difference in hits happens to equal the rupture trigger of the Greek unit, which is 3. 4 hits to 1 hit, difference of 3, that's the rupture trigger. Now, in most circumstances, a steady unit does not have to take a rupture catastrophe test, even if that difference in hits equals or exceeds its rupture trigger. But because the Galatians inflicted this difference in hits using shock, the Greek unit is forced to take its rupture catastrophe test. And you can see the result on the right side. I should point out that the Greeks had a pretty good chance of passing this test. Their combat and control value of 4 was increased to 5 because the unit was steady. But the roll of 5 equals that combat and control value and does not, in fact, pass the unit. It needed to roll under the combat and control value, and as a consequence, it breaks and runs. So here we have another melee scenario. This time, it's a flank charge. A Macedonian shock massed cavalry unit with a combat and control value of 4 is charging into those pesky Galatians again, also a combat and control value of 4, but this time, as I say, hit into the flank. It should be pointed out that flank and rear charges, although different in terms of their physical approach, use exactly the same mechanics. Because the Galatians have been hit in the flank, and again would be the same if they had been struck in the rear, they immediately become unformed, and unformed units lose all plus modifiers in melee, including shock. I should point out that the infantry would have lost their shock anyway, even if the fight had been frontal. Infantry lose shock when engaged against mounted units. But either way, this is a bad circumstance for the Galatians. But you might think, well, becoming unformed isn't exactly a huge penalty, even with the loss of some plus modifiers that they may have been awarded. But things are not so generous. having struck their opponent in the flank and being formed, not unformed, the cavalry not only get their shock bonus, but will double the number of dice they throw to resolve the melee. This is going to be nasty. In that first turn of melee, the Galatians only throw 3 dice. Remember, their combat and control value is 4, but it's a -1 for being unformed. The cavalry, they start also with their base value of 4 dice for their combat and control value, and then they add 2 more dice for their shock bonus, and then, because it's a flank charge, they double that total. So they throw 12 dice. And you can see the results on the left. The Macedonian cavalry scored 6 hits versus only 1 hit inflicted by the Galatians. This is a huge differential. You immediately mark those hits and, of course, assess the results of being the winner and loser. In this particular case, the Galatians immediately become shaken. And because of the difference in hits that equals or exceeds the rupture trigger, the Galatians are forced to take a rupture catastrophe test. In this particular case, their combat and control value against which they throw that single die is reduced. They're no longer steady, so they don't get the bonus for that. And because it's a flank charge, their combat and control value actually shrinks to being 3. They needed to throw a 1 or 2 to pass that test. And with good fortune, that's exactly what they do. They throw a 1, and they'll continue the fight into the next turn. In the next turn of melee, the results are a little less favorable for the Macedonian cavalry. The number of dice they throw is reduced down to their combat and control value. They've lost their shock bonus, but they still double the number of dice because it's a flank charge. They throw 8 dice, and they manage to score 4 hits. The Galatians, well, they're now down to 2 dice because they're unformed and shaken. These are -1 modifiers for each effect. But they're lucky. They score 2 hits. Now you might think 4 hits to 2 hits isn't exactly a great exchange, and it's not. The Galatians are certainly in trouble. But the difference is no longer equal or in excess of their rupture trigger value, and so no test is required for rupture, and they haven't arrived or exceeded their catastrophe trigger, which is 12. And so the fight goes on. They have lost this round of melee, but not significantly enough to cause any kind of test. So here we are, the third turn of melee. Remember, melees are calculated every turn. Whether you're active or non-active, the melee continues. This time things aren't going to go very well for the Galatians. Both sides roll the same number of dice as they threw in the second turn of melee. 8 dice for the cavalry, 2 dice for the infantry. The cavalry, however, score 5 hits. The infantry, the Galatians, only score 1. The 1 hit on the cavalry is immediately marked, but the Galatians, carrying 10 hits from a previous turn, now, strictly speaking, have 15 hits, but as soon as they reached their catastrophe trigger, 12 hits or more, we no longer need to track their hits. They are teetering on the edge of breaking now for the rest of the game. So this is now a desperate situation. So not only have they lost this turn of melee, and need now to take a catastrophe test, they also suffered a difference in hits that equaled or exceeded their rupture trigger, and so have to take a test for that as well. Things are looking very, very bad, and the Galatians roll their 2 catastrophe dice, catastrophe test and rupture catastrophe test, and need to roll under their modified combat and control value. This is a disaster. They are lucky in rolling at least a 1, but the 6 is an emphatic failure, and you only need to fail one of these for the unit to break. So here we have the results of that failed die roll. The Galatians are broken, and although it's modeled here for the photograph that they're fleeing, in fact they're just simply removed from the table. The cavalry now have to determine what the results of this melee will do to them. Will they remain in control, or will they pursue? To determine that, they have to roll immediately a control test. A control test, like every other test in the game, requires that they roll a d6 and try to get a result below their combat and control value. I should point out that the army lists will indicate if there's any modifiers that might apply to that combat and control value for the purposes of a control test. Some units will have plus modifiers that raise their combat and control value to make it easier for them to pass tests. This would apply to very disciplined units. Less disciplined units, medieval knights for example, they actually get negative modifiers to their combat and control value when it comes to rolling for things like momentum or pursuit. For sake of argument, we'll say that these Macedonian cavalry are just regulars and they need to roll less than 4. As you can see in the image, they failed, they rolled a 5, and they immediately have to take a normal move, a 2 action move, straight forward. And a pursuit always renders the unit unformed, so that marker is placed immediately as well. It's a good result, obviously, for the cavalry to have defeated the Galatians, but this pursuit could render them vulnerable should enemy units be present in the area, and if, in fact, it's the enemy's active turn coming up. But there it is, the results of melee. To this point, you've heard me talk about control tests, catastrophe tests, and rupture catastrophe tests. And so it probably doesn't come as any surprise that these tests are quite commonly applied throughout the game. One of the essential truths of this game is that no unit breaks automatically for reaching, let's say, a threshold of a certain number of hits. Units break because they fail either a catastrophe test or a rupture catastrophe test. And as the titles of those tests indicate, those two tests are effectively the same. It's just the circumstances that require the test that are different. The other kind of test is a control test, and this represents the ability of a unit to either remain in good order or to succeed in achieving a certain kind of maneuver, or it can be applied, I think as the name suggests, to circumstances where a unit is trying to keep control in circumstances like suffering momentum, or in circumstances after a melee where you're trying to avoid having to pursue the enemy. So these tests are dotted through the game, and I think you become quite accustomed to quickly performing those tests. The only thing that's different ever is whether modifiers apply to the particular tests that you're completing. And those modifiers can vary from test to test. The modifiers have been kept to an absolute minimum, but as I say, they have some variation depending on the test that you're performing. You'll have to obviously use the play sheet to identify what tests and what modifiers apply in that particular circumstance. Just like me mentioning the various tests, I've also made mention of the procedure that's used to complete a test. All tests control tests, catastrophe tests, rupture catastrophe tests, all those tests use the same procedure. You roll the d6 and try to get a result below the modified combat and control value of the unit. The only thing that varies from test to test is, of course, the circumstance in which the test is required and the modifiers that apply to that particular test. The modifiers are few in number. I think you can memorize them. For example, for all control tests, being steady is a good thing. I think those things can be memorized. But if not, they're of course listed on the play sheet and, of course, in the rule book. To this point, we've dealt with the moving, shooting, and melee mechanics as applied to individual units. But if you look at the picture attached to this slide, we're dealing with armies, and armies in this period are usually contiguously deployed. And as a consequence, a unit that suffers the misfortune of being defeated and broken, this can have, of course, a horrible impact on the battle line overall. We talked in the previous presentation, for example, about brigade splintering. That's that command and control problem where a single brigade is divided into two or more bodies of units that somehow have to be controlled. But the breaking of a unit can also cause a contagion of routes. And this is something that the brigade losses catastrophe test endeavors to represent. When a unit is broken, if it has friendly units from the same brigade in an adjacent box, adjacent laterally or diagonally or front to back, those friendly units, if they're shaken, they too have to roll a catastrophe test to see if they too break. The other kind of catastrophe test that applies when a unit breaks and affects other units is when a unit that's broken flees into another friendly unit. This is called a flight path catastrophe test. And this applies to any unit, including those that are not already shaken. So a steady unit. Here again, that unit has to take a catastrophe test. The fact that it might be steady is a benefit to the unit, but nevertheless, the breaking of a unit can cause that sort of contagious breaking of other units. And it certainly isn't unusual in a control to catastrophe game to see whole battle lines cascading one after the other, sort of units breaking and causing the defeat of the entire army. And I think history shows that this would not indeed be an entirely unusual occurrence. So keep in mind, brigade losses and flight path catastrophe tests. Thanks for looking at presentation 2. I hope you found it interesting and informative. Now I invite you to turn to presentation 3. In presentation 3, I'll be looking at a lengthy section of the rules called Special Rules for Special Units. It's here where a lot of the historical character and tactical flavor of particular armies is developed. I won't be looking at all the rules presented there, but I will certainly highlight two of them, one in the ancient period and one for the medieval period. For the ancient period, I think it's absolutely essential that the Romans be represented correctly. And in that section of the rules, we deal with that interesting and somewhat mysterious system called line support. There's a lot of different names for this, but essentially it's that process of the lines of Roman infantry, whether maniples or cohorts in the later period, offering support to one another. The rules for this add a tremendous amount to the way that the Roman armies play on the tabletop. For the medieval period, we're looking at the mixed longbow and men-at-arms and bill units. This is characteristic of English armies, and particularly those of the later Middle Ages, all the way up into the Wars of the Roses. This is another dynamic and interesting way of representing these units, and I think adds a lot to the tabletop experience of those who've collected those English armies, whether for the later Hundred Years' War or, as I say, the Wars of the Roses. So I invite you to turn your attention to presentation 3.